Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you, everyone. It is a delight to be here, and this indeed is an important subject for us to spend time thinking about together. We are trying to make sense of something that's not easy to make sense of, and it does indeed pose a challenge to not just our culture, but to many individuals within our culture. I mean, I think our culture is greatly confused, but there are particular people who are struggling with gender identity concerns or confusion, and we want to know how to think helpfully about their situation and respond compassionately to them. Now, you may be aware that the experience of gender incongruence, the feeling like you're not in the right body, that experience is not a new thing in our world. It really goes back, well, almost to the beginning, at least since sin and death have entered our world, and disease and dysfunction and disorder and dysphorias of various kinds. There have been people who, for one reason or another, have just felt ill at ease in the bodies that God has given them. So this is not a new phenomenon in that sense. But what is new, and really quite new, is the number of people who are presenting or experiencing or expressing some degree of gender incongruence or gender dysphoria. We'll explain some of these terms a bit more in just a moment. And so that begs a question that many people are wrestling with, sociologists and historians and others. Why is this so? Why this escalation? Why this explosion of this phenomenon that we're experiencing at the present time, at least in the Western world? And there are at least, several reasons that I can identify, and I'll just spell them out very quickly for you. The first has to do with the impact of what we generally call the sexual revolution, right? That move that began in the early 1960s. It was effectively kicked off by the advent of the contraceptive pill. But that whole revolution in sexual understanding, sexual mores, was profound. It sought to overthrow all traditional forms of sexual thought, sexual behaviour, interpersonal relationships, and of course many of us have been very much aware of that. We've lived through it to some degree and seen the outcomes of it. And that's the second point. The effects of the sexual revolution have been extraordinary and indeed catastrophic at many levels, but perhaps most profoundly the impacts have been felt upon the family. But again, sociologists and others have mapped these out. There's been the rapid sort of increase of premarital promiscuity, extramarital adultery, an escalation of divorce rates, premarital cohabitation rates, the number of children born out of wedlock, either into dysfunctional homes or single-parent homes. You've got increased domestic violence, which tracks along with that, of course, because the more fractured families are, the more these things present. And then you've got the horrific phenomenon of interfamilial sexual abuse, which, again, we're sadly too much aware of. And they're just some of the outcomes or effects of the sexual revolution. And then thirdly, just if you thought perhaps things couldn't get even more complicated or more messy, we've had in recent decades the development of what some people call queer theory, others gender theory. We'll talk a bit more about it this morning. But perhaps the key idea we're wanting to come to grips with this morning that's at the heart of gender theory or queer theory is this idea that a person's gender has nothing to do with their sex, nothing to do with their biology, that gender is a psychosocial construct that is entirely independent of biological reality. That's sort of the central conception, really, that's right there in contemporary gender theory. And so your gender identity really, there's no reason why it should align with the sex of your body. If it happens to, well and good. But if it happens not to, well, supposedly well and good as well. So you can either be cisgender, having a gender identity on the same side as your sex, or transgender, having a gender identity on the other side. Claire will say a bit more about these terms again as we go along. But as a consequence of that idea and the influence of that idea, more and more people are identifying in some gender non-conforming fashion. So you not only have transgender, which of course is perhaps the most prominent of those identities, but you also have things like pangender or bigender or trigender or ambigender or omnigender or polygender or gender fluid or gender diverse or gender queer or agender or anti-gender. And that's the tip of the iceberg. right? I was looking at a site the other day that had over 150 different gender identities. They just keep proliferating. And so we've got a social situation where we've got a lot of vulnerable individuals coming out of sort of fractured origins who are being exposed to an ideology that is profoundly destabilising and confusing, and consequently more and more people are confused and more are even feeling pressured to adopt an identity that is in some way unique. One teenager said to a Brisbane psychiatrist recently, as I was reading in an article, he said, "I want to be transgender, it's the new black." Right? So there was clearly great social pressure, peer pressure being felt by this young man to be something special, and this seemed to be the obvious way out. And so all of that just, I guess, begs the question, how do we help? How do we respond? How do we think rightly, act rightly in this situation? And I want to put some questions up here, which we'll come back to a little later on. But these, I think, are the sort of obvious questions that emerge as we start to ask that larger question, how do we help? Well, here they are, you see. How do we teach and encourage those who are conflicted and confused? How do we counsel and care for those who experience gender incongruence? How do we best support their families and friends? How do we effectively evangelise gender non-conforming people? What does repentance mean for someone who has undergone gender transition? We'll talk about the various stages that people transition, but what does repentance mean if someone's gone down that path? What does Christian discipleship mean, likewise, for someone who battles ongoing gender incongruence? Okay, so these are some of the questions we want to grapple with this morning, and I hope by the end you'll at least have answers in your mind, or at least have heard our answers to these questions. And if you feel we haven't answered any of them, there'll be question time at the end, and you can push us to give you even more clarity if you feel you need it. Now, one of the things that, of course, is central to our convictions is that we need to go ultimately to Scripture to be guided in these areas and to hear what God has to say to the brokenness and the confusion of our world. And so that's where we'll spend most of our time in due course. But before we get there, there's a few things we want to do, and one of them is just to help unpack the terminology that's become part of the discussion about these matters, because there's a lot of interesting and, again, somewhat confusing terms. And Claire is a bit of an expert on the terminology, and so she's going to take us from here.
I think expert is probably a little generous, but, I'll take what I'm given. All right, so now if you're note takers, this is the time to, limber up and get ready, because I'm going to move through things pretty quickly. But you'll be aware that there's a whole new vocabulary that's used in discussing these things, and which itself is changing and used in different ways, even by some of those taking part in the public discourse. So it's important just for us to clarify at the beginning how we're using terms. So first up, the first one is biological sex. Sometimes this is also referred to as birth sex, which is actually a term that I prefer not to use because it seems to indicate that you can have a sex other than the one that you were born with. So biological sex. This has to do with biology, chromosomes, gonads, genitals, primary and secondary sex characteristics like body shape, voice pitch, and hair distribution. This answers the question, what is male and what is female? That's biological sex. Next is sex and sexuality. Now, these terms often get confused. Sex, as I've just said, refers to biological, that is, bodily sex. Sexuality refers to sexual and/or romantic attraction or orientation. So the first is about the objective facts of your body, and the second is about whom we find subjectively attractive. Next two terms, sex and gender, these also get easily confused, often get confused. Sex refers to biological sex, as I've said. Gender is the psychological and social aspect of how sex is presented, how it is lived. in things like gender roles, in dress and demeanour, and in social conventions and cultural gender norms. And they vary in different cultures. So in some cultures, men wear skirts. Scotland, where our son lives. Not so many men wear skirts here, I've noticed. So some variation in cultures. The question here is, what is masculine and what is feminine? And this distinction between sex and gender dates from the early 60s, about 1963 as far as we can tell. Although what we're seeing now in our culture is the decoupling of sex and gender. So difference between distinguishing and decoupling. Next, sexuality and gender identity. These two also get confused. Sexuality, as I've just said, is about sexual attraction. Gender identity is about how a person feels or experiences themselves. So it's a private and subjective sense of identity as male or female or increasingly something else these days. The question here is, who do I feel that I am? And in popular culture, the way this difference is sometimes put is, sexual orientation determines who you want to go to bed with. Gender identity determines what you want to go to bed as. Next, gender roles. Now, these are the common accepted expectations of maleness and femaleness and include social and behavioural expectations. And these may change from one culture to another, and some are biologically based, such as the roles of mother and father, or pregnant or breastfeeding mothers. So some reflection of biology. Next term is cisgender. This is where a person's gender identity and gender roles are aligned with their biological sex and with society's expectations of that biological sex. Cis comes from the Latin, meaning on this side of. And it's the opposite of trans, which means on the opposite side of, and assumes the existence of trans as a normal, healthy experience. And for that reason, it's a term that I choose not to use. It has embedded in it an ideology that I don't accept. Next is gender dysphoria. Now, this is the new medical term for the distress associated with having a psychological or emotional gender identity that doesn't match with a person's biological sex. And it replaces the previous term, which was gender identity disorder, which was used in the DSM-4, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. It's kind of like it's published in America, but it's like a sort of one of the Bibles for psychiatrists for mental health conditions. So in 1994, this condition was called gender identity disorder, which focused on the incongruity or the mismatch between biological sex and gender identity. This new term, introduced in 2013 in the DSM-5, so the next edition, this mismatch is no longer considered a disorder. Okay? Rather, it is the distress associated with the mismatch that is the disorder. So you could have this mismatch and not be distressed by it and not have a mental health condition. Can you see the logic there? And that change has been made for ideological reasons, not because of new medical discoveries. And that means treatment now aims to alleviate distress rather than align gender identity and biological sex. Do you see the logic there? Well, how that's shifted. And proponents of gender diversity often claim the distress is caused by unhealthy, rigid cultural norms, or what's called heteronormativity. So what's heteronormativity? Possibly you've heard this term. Well, it's the belief that biological sex is binary, that is, male and female, and corresponds with gender, is aligned with gender, and that only sexual relations with the opposite sex are normal and natural. Heteronormativity is basically the biblical view of sex and gender, but actually the way that it's often expressed is not a way that I would want to express it. And so again, it's another term that I would prefer not to use, because it is the view increasingly labelled homophobic and transphobic. So next to the LGBT acronym, the first three, LGB, that's lesbian, gay and bisexual, have to do with sexual orientation, so sexuality. T refers to transgender. Now, transgender is an umbrella term for people with healthy male or female bodies whose gender identity differs from their biological sex to varying degrees, and who want to express the gender with which they identify by socially transitioning, that is cross-dressing, and or cross-hormone therapy, and or sex reassignment surgery. Now, what's easy to miss is that there are actually at least two groups under the transgender umbrella, and they're quite different, and we need to respond to them quite differently. The first group I would call ideologues and experimenters and activists. They reject the male-female gender binary, sex and gender binary, and their gender nonconformity is a form of protest. Okay, they're wanting to dismantle the system. That's the first group. The second group are those with gender dysphoria, with this mental health condition, or who firmly believe in the male-female binary. They just feel that they're in the wrong body. So there's two groups that we need to be aware of and engage with quite differently, I think. Now, unlike LGB, transgender is about identity, not about sexual orientation or sexuality. So trans people might be straight, lesbian, gay or bi, but not the way that we might think. So, for example, a trans man, that is a female to male, FTM, who is attracted to women would be considered straight. That is heterosexual, even though biologically the two are female. Do you follow that? Okay, often additional letters, you'll be aware, are added to the LGBT acronym. The first is I. This is for intersex. This doesn't have to do with sexual orientation or gender identity, but has to do with rare physical conditions where there is ambiguity in a person's genes, anatomy, or sex characteristics. That is, it is biologically based, and for this reason, a lot of intersex people don't want to be incorporated into the acronym. They see themselves as quite distinct from it. Q stands for queer or questioning. Questioning means you're still trying to work out who you are and where you are on the spectrum. Queer rejects binary notions of sex and gender, that is, male and female, and the norms, and believes that there is a spectrum or a diversity across the population and fluidity within the individual. So across the population, many different genders, and within the individual, fluidity so that you can wake up in the morning as a man and go to bed as a woman. So shifting. Sometimes A is added for agender or without gender. And this A was also used in the Safe Schools Coalition material, very cleverly, I think, in a bad way, which was that you could become an LGBT ally, which meant that you could join the acronym without joining the acronym. So it caught up everyone in the acronym. Some other terms, assigned sex, this is another term that's changing. In the past it was used for assigning sex to those with intersex conditions where there was biological ambiguity at birth. That's how assigned sex was used. It wasn't linked to gender dysphoria. Increasingly, though, as part of the trend to see gender as a social construct, assigned sex is being used for the so-called label one is given at birth. That is, it's a girl, it's a boy. Often with the notion this label is arbitrary and imposed on the infant without their permission and without seeing which gender the child wants to be. Again, assigned sex is a term that I would not use. Sex reassignment surgery. Now, this later notion of assigning sex lies behind the term sex reassignment surgery. Can you see that? Because it smuggles in the idea that sex is assigned in the first place. But putting that problem aside, sex reassignment surgery refers to surgical procedures to alter an otherwise healthy body to bring it into conformity with the person's chosen gender. So it's accompanied by cross-hormone therapy to develop secondary sex characteristics, such as facial hair, deepened voice, and muscle development in females, or breast development and female fat distribution in males. Now, there are two other issues of popular terminology to be aware of. The first is the popular characterisation of transgenderism as a man trapped in a woman's body or a woman trapped in a man's body. This is both helpful and unhelpful. It's helpful because it captures the extreme existential angst of people suffering from gender dysphoria. It's helpful in that regard, and it should give us a deep, deep compassion for them. But it's unhelpful because it omits the words feels like. It makes it sound as if there really is a man in a woman's body or a woman in a man's body, rather than the person feels like they have the wrong body. That is, it's a subjective, not an objective phenomenon. The other issue is that of pronouns. That is the he, she, him, her, his, hers, words that we use all the time with barely a second thought. You don't even have to put your brain into gear to use them. These pronouns can be very distressing to people, a person with gender dysphoria. And the trend, you may be aware, is to adopt a person's preferred pronoun. In fact, there are forms these days that ask people to nominate their preferred pronoun. And just this week, you might have read that the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services has introduced They Day on the first Wednesday of every month, where the 10,000 employees of the department have to avoid gendered pronouns and use gender-neutral pronouns all day. And there are some of the Z, Zem, Zer. Some examples of non-gendered pronouns. Okay, now my practice when I'm with someone who is suffering from gender dysphoria is to avoid using gendered pronouns and gendered titles for that person while I'm with them, like son or sister. Now, this avoids causing the person distress, which is important, but it's also consistent with my belief in the God-givenness and correlation of sex and gender, that it's important to me that my speech reflects my beliefs. And so that's my practice. And I'm about to hand back to Rob, and of course we can have more questions on this later.
Now, you'll be pleased to know there won't be a test. But hopefully you were able to digest at least enough of those different terms and conceptions that we can now, I guess, build on some of that understanding. Because I want just, before we have our morning tea break, to think just a little more about what I've called on the outline here, the brave new world of gender plasticity. And we really, I guess, need to go to the whole identity question that is at the heart of everything we're talking about today. Because if we can sort of get that in focus, we'll understand at least the key, I think, to what's going on. Now, asking questions of identity is, not a new thing. The ancient Greeks were asking them, and of course the Old Testament people of God, the Hebrew peoples were asking them. It's there in Psalm 8, isn't it? What is man that you are mindful of him, the Son of Man that you should care for him? That's asking the identity question. Okay, so who am I? Well, human beings have been putting that question forward for a long time. Now, that is the way, I guess, right up until very recently, at least, the question was being posed. But in recent years, the form of the question has changed. So who am I was the old form. The new form is what do I identify as? Okay, so what's the difference here? Well, the who am I question assumes that there is an I to be discovered, right? That you are someone and you just got to, as it were, tune in to who you are and understand who you've been made to be. The what do I identify as question, that really presupposes that you aren't necessarily anything and you need to choose what you are. Choose what you're going to identify as, okay? So that form of the question puts chosenness over givenness, right? And likewise, as Claire said, possible changeability over stability. Okay, so who you are is not something that's given to you and stable, it's something you choose and indeed something you can change. Now, that's, as I said, I think the key to understanding this sort of brave new world of gender plasticity. And the word plasticity is used in a lot of the discussions, sometimes even the word plasticine, because, again, it's this idea that there is a diverse range of genders, possibly infinite, some would say, and likewise this capacity to move around, right, the fluidity. So gender diversity and gender fluidity, those two ideas go together. Many genders and the possibility of moving back and forth along the gender spectrum. Now, the reason those two ideas go hand in hand is actually fairly straightforward if you think about it. See, most people are still willing to say, yes, okay, biological sex is male and female. You're either XX or XY. Okay, we understand that. Now, having said that, there are people challenging that too, but we won't worry about that this morning. But most people say, yeah, okay, biological sex, male and female. But if gender has got nothing to do with sex, right, once you decouple it, as Claire said, or disconnect it, then there's absolutely no reason why gender should sort of share the binary character of sex. Okay, yeah, okay, sex is binary, male or female, but if gender's got nothing to do with sex, why does gender have to be binary? And so that's where things are going and why you get a statement. It's from the Safe Schools material, from the booklet called All of Us. And I haven't managed to put it on the screen for you, I'm sorry. But the booklet says this: gender isn't quite as simple as whether you're male or female. Everyone has their own gender identity in relation to masculinity or femininity. Okay, so you might be at either end, or you might be somewhere in between, or somewhere outside of the box, who knows. Some identify with both, some identify with neither, and some identify with one or the other. It's up to the individual to describe what gender identity fits them best. Okay, there's the key. It's up to the individual to describe what gender identity fits them best. And that's why some are saying there are potentially as many genders as there are people on the planet. And as some feminists have pointed out, well, what you've done at that point is really just conflate gender with personality and taste and preference and those things, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But again, this is the key to current gender ideology. This total self-determination, unlimited expressive individualism, some people call it. And this is a new idea. Yeah, this really is new on the scene. Not people being confused, as we've said, that goes way back, but this ideology that has come in to validate such confusion. So it's worth asking just a little more about where does this come from, and how has it sort of landed on us just almost overnight, sort of seemingly out of the blue? And, well, part of the answer to that question is it hasn't actually come from nowhere. It's been creeping up on us for a long time. It's been happening incrementally for at least half a century. Okay, so again, it goes back into the 60s. In fact, the whole transgender revolution has been intertwined with the gay rights movement and the feminist revolution almost from the get-go, as they say. It's just that we haven't seen it. As it were, it's been sort of tucked in behind these two major social movements. And so, again, most people have been a little oblivious, as was I, to the significance of the transgender dimension of the broader sexual revolution. But in 2013, Western society reached what many have called the transgender tipping point, and there was the Time magazine cover story, which features a transgender actor called Laverne Cox, who is a male, biologically speaking, but clearly a male who's transitioned. And it was part of the promotion of certain transgender celebrities like Laverne Cox that helped to bring this tipping point about. A tipping point is, again, a sociological concept. It's a way of describing that sort of moment where things shift from one place to another, where something that was previously unthinkable suddenly becomes very thinkable. Something that was unacceptable becomes very acceptable. It's a way of just describing that transition, that tipping point. And that seems to be what has happened in Western culture. We've sort of crossed that bridge, and something that was previously regarded as a comic matter. If you think of a movie, I don't know if you've seen it, but a movie like Life of Brian, the Monty Python crowd, where they've got a funny scene there about a man who wants to be called Loretta because he wants to have babies, and it's all comical, you see. It was a joke, but not now. Now very, very, very serious. And so we're on the other side of the tipping point. And again, as we said, the key idea that now is being embraced is this idea that gender is disconnected from biology. Gender is a psychosocial construct. Well, biology obviously is something that you can't change in that sense. Now, where has this ideology emerged from? Well, the seeds of it were there in feminist thought. If you think of the famous line that many of us have heard from Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, where she says, one is not born but becomes a woman. One is not born but becomes a woman. Now, in one sense, she was exactly right. Little girls aren't born women, they grow into women. But there was a distinction being made here between sex and gender. Not a disconnection, but a distinction. But it was the logic of that distinction that then got developed beyond that point. And what happened, of course, throughout the 60s and certainly the 70s is that feminist thought intermingled, as it were, with homosexual thought, and then morphed into this new thing we call now queer theory or gender theory. And the links go like this. If being born female and becoming a woman are two different things, and if there's no necessary correlation between your biological sex and your sexual orientation, that's where the homosexual idea comes in. If you're born male, it doesn't mean you're going to be attracted to females. Okay, so this is feminism built on top of by homosexual thought. Then the next step is to say, well, why should there be any correlation between your biological sex and your gender identity? Especially if gender really is a psychosocial construct. I mean, why do we insist on a connection? And so this is where the queer theorists are saying, well, if feminism's right and the homosexual ideology is right, then this is what follows. Well, this is where we are. Whether or not you can follow those links doesn't matter so much, but this is where we've got to. We've severed this connection between sex and gender, and so gender now is whatever you want it to be. Or, as I've recently discovered, whatever it wants to be. So here are some of the strange gender terms I've come across recently. I'm not even quite sure how you say this one. Apconsugender. According to the list on the Tumblr site, this means, as it says there, that you know what your gender isn't, but not what it is. The gender is hiding itself even from you. This is supposedly a genuine and serious gender identity. Or similarly, this one, Verengender. Verengender, that's your gender will shift and change the moment it is identified. Now, again, these things sound comical, and in one sense they are, but many have taken them very, very seriously. Now, again, what all this is telling us, friends, is that we are in a context now which is a bit of a perfect storm for producing especially confused adolescents and children, but also confused adults as well. And so it's a bit of a recipe for, sort of social and sexual chaos and some, moral anarchy and so on. So it's a rather tragic scene that we are stepping into, and it has many real-life consequences. And I'm about to show you a picture, which is a very confronting picture, so I'll warn you in advance. It's of a woman who has hormonally transitioned, but has then decided to stop taking the testosterone and to conceive a child. And so here's a picture of this woman breastfeeding her child, but you'll see the effects of the cross-sex hormones. So there is Evan is the name of this person with her child. Now, there are many, many other, anecdotes I could give you. I won't share many, but here's just one from the US. A women's college in Massachusetts named Mount Holyoke College remains, it tells us, committed to its historic mission as a women's college. But as you see, here are all the people who can attend the college. Biologically born female who identifies as a woman. Okay, that's been the traditional enrolment policy, but now biologically born female who identifies as a man, so Evan, of course, could attend. Thirdly, a biologically born female who identifies as other, or they, or Z, or some of these pronouns. And then a biologically born male, biologically born, we're up to, lost track, biologically born female who does not identify either as woman or man, so neither. And then biologically born male who identifies as a woman. Okay, so basically men can go to the college. And then biologically born male who identifies as other when the other includes woman. Okay, so you can have multiple gender identities, but as long as one of them is female, you can attend. Okay, that's in Massachusetts. In New York City, you may have heard, you can be fined up to $250,000 for deliberately misgendering a person. That is, calling somebody by the wrong pronoun or referring to someone as a man who may well be and have XY chromosomes but wants to identify as a woman. Well, you can be fined for that, and if you're a repeat offender or if it's deemed malicious, you can be fined up to $250,000. Claire's already mentioned They Day, which the Victorian Health and Human Services Department has recently introduced. Here in Queensland, you'll be aware, some of you may be aware, of a Toowoomba GP named David Van Gend, who has been called to answer charges of discriminatory conduct simply for posting or reposting a tweet that recommended or commended this book that I'm holding up here called When Harry Became Sally. It's a very, very good book, a very helpful book, a very carefully written book, and a compassionate book. It's not an inflammatory book or a cruel book or anything like that, but he's undergoing disciplinary action for simply commending this on his Twitter page. And so again, these are tip of the iceberg things. There are many, many, many other instances we could relate, but it does tell us, of course, that this tipping point is well and truly behind us, and we are now in this brave new world of gender plasticity. And I just share these stories with you, not to make you afraid, because some Christians are afraid of what is happening, and one sense, that's a valid response, but the Lord is sovereign over these changes and matters, so we just need to rest in him. But I think what these developments force us to do is to go to Scripture and say, Lord, okay, how do we think wisely and well about these matters so that we might respond to the challenges that are facing us and growing, developing around us?